Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather this evening and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us tonight. It's a privilege to come together on this land, which has historically been a place of learning, storytelling, and community. My name is Ben Donovan, and I'm a member of the Brisbane chapter of the Faculty of Business, Economics and Law Alumni Ambassador Council, or the Bell Alumni Ambassador Council. Tonight's event is a special collaboration between our council and the Young Alumni Board. The Young Alumni Board are focused on providing opportunities for young professionals to upskill and connect. We're thrilled to welcome all of our alumni to this important conversation on the implications of US tariffs for Australia. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. This event is being recorded, and for those in our alumni community who couldn't join us in person, there will be a recording available. Please also feel free to engage in questions and answers throughout the evening. We will have a roaming mic for those people in the room. And for those of us that are joining us online, we will also be taking questions from our digital audience as well. Okay, one of the big rules for tonight, and one that I've just had to remind myself of, is if you do have a mobile phone device, and I'm sure you do, if you can please switch that to silent, as we don't want any embarrassing alarms going off. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Annie Leakes. Annie is our co-chair of the Bell Alumni Council here in Brisbane, and she will be navigating us through this discussion on tariffs this evening. Can you please join me in welcoming Annie?
Thanks so much, Ben. I'm delighted to welcome you all here for this very topical discussion, and we have an absolutely sensational panel to help deliver what is, I hope, some interesting insights about tariffs and tariff wars. This event sold out within 24 hours of opening, which I think speaks to just how topical this has become. For me, what we're seeing with tariffs making headlines and the politicization of tariffs is really an intersection of economics and politics that we don't often see. So I'm really excited to hear more about that this evening. So let's kick off with a bit of scene setting. Linda, for you, what is a tariff and how does it work?
Okay, Econ 101, a tariff. It's a tax. It's just another tax. It's not a tax on your income. It's not a tax on your spending like a GST. It's a tax on imports. So it is, in simple terms, it is paid by the importing person and it is paid to the government. Sounds really simple. And in some cases, it can be quite simple. In some examples, it can get a lot more complicated. Let's start with a really simple example. Say I'm an American company that's importing shoes, Nikes from Vietnam. We start with tariffs at 0, and Trump says tariffs are going to be 20%. We're going to impose 20% tariff. So I import $100 worth of shoes and I pay $20 to the government because I am the importer. So my costs go up by 20%. So what do? I've got choices. I can wear that cost in my profit margins. I might be selling those shoes that I paid $100 for $200. I might be making $100 profit. Going forward, if I pay my tariff, I'm only making $80 profit. I can wear it in my profit margins if I choose to. Not so good for equity market valuations if everyone does that. The other thing I can do is I can say, I don't want to wear the cost. I'm going to pass it on to the next person down the line. The next person down the line is the consumer. So instead of me selling my shoes for $200, I'll sell them for $220. So the consumer then pays the cost of that tariff. So really simple in that situation. What does the consumer do? If they've got to pay this extra tariff, they've got to pay an extra fee, they might decide, actually, I can't buy 3 pairs of shoes. I can only buy 2. So they consume less. So that will reduce the amount the country is importing, which improves the trade balance. Sounds great. The consumer might say, those shoes are too dear for me now. I'm going to buy cheaper shoes. Is there any cheaper shoes that I can buy? Maybe there's shoes that are produced in the US that don't have a tariff. I'll buy them. Sorry, there aren't any. Sorry, you can't buy those. You've got to pay the extra. So in the situation where there's no domestic production, the tariff doesn't get any more domestic production happening. It can't. So it's just a cost that's paid by the consumer. It goes to the government. So the government gets the tariff revenue. What do they do with it? They might choose to improve their bottom line, pay down debt, reduce the burden on future generations of the debt. That might be a good thing to do. They might look at the consumer and say, you poor consumer, you're paying more. Here's a handout. I'll subsidise you. Why did we bother? It's not going to achieve anything. The other thing they might do is spend it on tax cuts. So they might give tax cuts either to the consumer or they might give tax cuts to business. So the government then gets to choose who to give the stimulus to. They can give it back to the consumer, they can give it to business, they can give it to future generations. That's the simple example. It gets much harder than that. What if we think about something like aluminium and steel? Aluminium and steel has a domestic industry in the US. Putting a tariff on foreign producers, on the imports, makes the domestic producer more competitive. If I put a 50% tariff, which is what Trump has done on steel and aluminium, that's increasing the import price and it's giving a really big boost to the competitiveness of the US producer. We're going to produce more steel. Great. We're going to employ more people. Great. In the aluminium and steel industry. Sounds fantastic. We're getting more US production. We're getting more US employment. And we're improving our trade balance. It's a win. Only problem is that steel and aluminium is an input into other industries. They've got to pay the higher price. They've got the higher input costs. What do? They sack people. They don't produce as much. They don't do so well. So with the tariffs that Trump has put in place, there's different industries that he has put tariffs on at different rates. He's put tariffs on different countries at different rates. It's really affecting, it's pushing up prices in the US. We can see that in the data. It's pushing up consumer prices and it's pushing up input costs in some of these industries, which will then get passed on. At the moment, profit margins may be a little bit squeezed. Companies imported a lot before the tariffs hit. They said, hey, we've seen this before. We saw this a few years ago. So they imported so much at the start of the year that they're using those inventories. So the whole process is being a little bit drawn out. But that's my background on tariffs, of what they are, who pays them, what happens with them. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in.
Just one other thing you can do is, if you're the shoe person, you can go to your supplier in Vietnam and say, you have to lower your
Give me a
price.
price cut.
And so some of the burden of the tax is felt by the exporter. Trump's idea is all of it's borne by the exporter. But
I think in practice, not a lot of that happens. I think most of it gets passed on to the additional cost to the consumer.
Great. So we've talked a bit about the impacts. So John, for you, what then was the economic thinking behind the push for tariff removals after World War II?
well, you really have to go back to 1914 to understand this story. Just after what seemed like the end of the Great War, but turned out only to be an interruption, John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, was writing to say, it's hard to remember what the world was like before 1914. You could, living in your house in London, you could pick up the phone, order products from anywhere around the world and expect they'd be delivered to your doorstep. If you felt like investing in railway bonds in South America, thought this was a good idea, you could call your stockbroker and they would do this. That completely collapsed with the outbreak of war in 1914. Then when the war, when at least the armistice ended, the first phase of the war, countries tried to rebuild that previous system, tried to go back on the gold standard, tried to rebuild trade, failed, and we had the Great Depression in the 1930s, and one of the factors contributing to that and famously blamed for it was the imposition of tariffs by the United States, the so-called Hawley-Smoot tariff, which actually was about lower than what Trump has recently imposed. So when finally Hitler was defeated, the victorious Allies said, we're never going to go through that again. We're going to rebuild an open world economy, doing it very, very slowly, however. They were still very suspicious of things like capital flows, but they set up arrangements to facilitate trade and to prevent the kind of competitive devaluation and tariffs that were seen as having not only destroyed the world economy, but also broken the world up into competing and hostile blocks. So what happened with these tariffs, for example, was that the whole British Commonwealth area, the sterling area as it was, had one set of tariffs against the rest of the world. The US had another. European countries had their own. And so and those formed the lines on which subsequent wars were fought. So we then had a system which included a system for managing exchange rate fluctuations, the so-called Bretton Woods system, and a system for dealing with the kinds of foreign exchange trade deficits, which potentially could bring the system as a whole. This was the establishment of the IMF, the National Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and later on the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was an attempt to gradually wind down the tariffs that were there at the end of 1945. All of this was set up in a system which critically was rooted through the US. The IMF and the World Bank were located in Washington. The United Nations, which replaced the League of Nations based in Geneva, was based in New York. The assumption was that the US, and finally the exchange rate system, was based centrally on the tie of the US dollar to the price of gold. So we had a system where the US was by far the biggest and most important country in the world, certainly in the part of the world outside the Soviet Union and its satellites. All these institutions were guaranteed and supported by the US in ways which, in the general telling of things, benefit everybody but the US most of all. And so that really was that the US took on a bunch of obligations, but in return got a system where it set most of the rules in ways that suited particularly the US model of capitalism.
So what trends did you see then over the intervening period, over the 50 years?
Well, the first things started going wrong with inflation in the 1960s. The Bretton Woods system, which was based on a fixed price of gold and US dollars, broke down in the 1970s, and we had a period of chaos then, which seemed to threaten the breakdown of the entire system. But instead, what we saw was, in important respects, a reinforcement of that process, where controls on capital flows, which had been tight right up until then, were broken down, so that we then got capital flows many hundreds of times more than is required to finance trade every day. I mentioned QIC is trading billions and billions of dollars worth of stuff in very complicated contracts, which don't bear any close relationship to anything, any buying and selling of goods and services that goes on, or even to any long-term investment. Those things are happening, but on a daily basis, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars are trading on the expectation that interest rates might move a fraction of a percentage point or two. So we then saw a hope in the 1990s that this would lead to a new era of prosperity. There was huge optimism around then, partly associated with the rise of the internet and the so-called dot-com boom, but in general with the idea that these free capital markets and management by central banks would permanently eliminate the cycle of boom and bust. As that fell in a heap, particularly with the global financial crisis, we're still really working through the consequences of that failure. And one of the consequences has been the rise of the populist political right represented by Trump.
Just generally on the trade side of things and the tariffs, that there'd been a gradual downward trend in the tariffs seen imposed by countries all around the world. You'd had a whole lot of free trade agreements, and the idea of free trade provides benefits to people. So if I'm really good at producing something, and John's not so good at producing it, but he's good at producing something else, it makes sense for me to produce a lot of what I'm good at, and for John to produce a lot of what he's really good at, and then we trade. Everyone ends up better off. We both end up better off. The whole world ends up better off. We get lower prices for the goods that we want to consume. We've got better access to markets. We get to specialize in the things that we're good at, and we get really good at it. You get productivity benefits from it. So since the 1940s, there'd been this gradual downward trend in tariffs, which had really benefited the world economy, and particularly countries like China. They had the growth that they were able to achieve through their exports and free market access meant that they went from being a low-income economy to like a middle-income economy. They started the process with basic manufacturing, so they were producing the Nikes, the clothing. We all knew about the Chinese specialization in the basic manufacturing. Over time, China has worked towards, as their incomes grew, they've moved into more advanced manufacturing. And so now they're producing cars, and they're producing solar panels, and they're producing a lot of them. And they're flooding the whole world with these advanced manufactured goods. That becomes a problem because the US and Europe were countries that had been specializing in the advanced manufacturing. So the benefits of free trade were shared by all, but they came to their limits. And the limits happened and have resulted in the reimposition of tariffs, and it's what's behind Trump trying to put these tariffs in place to reorient world trading systems.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because I think it is important for some perspective that the United States is not the only country that imposes tariffs. In fact, prior to the Trump tariffs, the US had probably the lowest average tariff rate for a long period of time around the world. Many other jurisdictions have continued, notwithstanding the agreements to reduce tariffs. Not everybody plays by the rules. And one of the reasons you see this reaction in the United States, and it's not just Trump, because this has bipartisan support in the US Congress and in the US polity, is because the view taken by many Americans was, well, for decades, we've had virtually no tariffs on anyone. And yet the Europeans have continued to impose tariffs against Americans and against others. The Chinese, who joined the WTO back in 2001, promised to move to a full market open economy as a condition of joining the WTO, but they still maintain tariffs to this day, notwithstanding they're the largest manufacturers in the world, and we should know that as Australians, because only a couple of years ago, Australia was subject to a swathe of tariffs imposed by China against Australian products going into China. And then if you look everywhere else, we could go around the world where there are tariffs. So we need to have perspective on this. Tariffs were coming down, but the US had the lowest tariffs generally of anybody. And the other part of trade is you've got tariffs or customs duties. You've also got what's called non-tariff barriers. And if you look at the trade figures and the finance figures, which I'll come to in a minute, they peaked at the time of the GFC. So after 2007, we've seen a decline in world trade and a decline which is relevant in world investment. And there's been a resort to more and more non-tariff barriers, impositions that are used to stop people being able to compete. So while I agree completely with Linda and John's view that in a perfect world, comparative competitive advantage in an open trading system is beneficial to both parties. But if both parties are not playing by the same rules, one is taking advantage of that and putting in place other mechanisms to prevent you being able to trade back, then it's not so fair. And this is what's happened. And the reason I raise finance is because the other side of it is, of course, when we run our current account or we have our trade account, we trade goods and services. The other side of that is what's called the capital account. So that's the money that comes back and forth, either foreign direct investment or borrowings that fund it, and they have to equal out. So they're not like a budget deficit where you can keep borrowing ad infinitum. If you're running a current account deficit, you'll be running a capital account surplus. And one of Trump's big issues that you hear him talk on and on about, whether you agree or not, which I don't necessarily, because they have to balance, is the United States is not running trade surpluses. So he feels he needs to pick on countries that they have a current account deficit with. What he doesn't say, however, is, but what about the capital account surplus that offsets it, which means there's a large amount of foreign savings that are being sent to the United States to subsidize effectively America's consumption economy. So again, those figures peaked at the GFC. So global investment, particularly FDI, peaked back almost 20 years ago now, and it's been on a downward decline. So both global trade's been falling, global investment's been falling, and this balkanization has happened, and Trump is now just the standard bearer of a very dramatic way of dealing with this issue.
I want to qualify that a bit because the US, as the trade system tended to break down, the US negotiated free trade agreements with a bunch of countries. And so the claim that those countries were imposing tariffs was untrue. And in particular with Australia, those agreements tended to preserve some US non-trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, while demanding complete free trade. In our case, for example, we didn't get complete access for beef or sugar, but we removed virtually all our barriers. So I think the claim of victimisation by the US is like most victim claims.
They still had the lowest average global tariff rates in the world.
Well, they had
lower than Australia.
No, I don't think that's true.
Australia don't now.
Well,
they don't now, but they did. They did for a long period of time.
Yes, certainly Australia.
Their average tariff rate was 1%. Australia's average tariff rate is 3%, still to this day.
Certainly, we have direct. Yeah, certainly they impose non-tariff barriers on us, which are more significant.
And we do as well.
Kind of, sort of. Yeah, I think certainly those to do what he did, Trump had to rip up agreements by which countries, many other countries.
China did too.
Oh, well, certainly, but the
EU won't even enter into a free trade agreement.
Well, I agree that China is certainly not a free trading country, but it's possibly not the relevant example here.
What is it's just picking up, David, on what you were saying. What is the political driver then that really has been fueling, whether it's against trade treaties that have been signed or otherwise, what is really the political driver that's sort of behind the new increases or Trump's approach?
Okay, well, there's a couple of things, but one of the reasons we have to remember why Trump has resorted to tariffs is because of the nature of the US political system, okay? It's very different to Australia. And he did this during his first period in office too, I might add. And when Joe Biden came to office, he didn't repeal any of them. In fact, he continued with them and he added a few more tariff barriers as well. But the reason they have done it, have reused tariffs, and they're not just doing it for trade purposes, I might add. There are a whole lot of other reasons they're using tariffs to do deals, so to speak, is because under the US system, the executive, that is the president, does have the ability, although that's now subject to challenge in the courts, but it has always been accepted through the act that they did, to impose tariffs through executive order. Now, this is something unusual. We don't have this in Australia. We don't have an ability for the Prime Minister or the Cabinet to impose an executive order to increase taxes, which is what a tariff does. But in the US, they can. The problem is, if most other things the US president wants to do, he has to get done through Congress, which, while he might have a slender majority at the moment in both houses of the Congress, passing major legislation through Congress is incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult, particularly as the Senate has this rule where you basically need 60 votes. You need a super majority to get things through the Senate.
He got the big, beautiful bill.
He got his big, but that's through what's called the budget reconciliation process, which is another thing. So if you want to discuss it, so what did Trump do with this money, which is one of the questions that comes up, and the latest figures have, so far they've collected $142 billion. And
in tariffs.
Yep, in tariffs, and there's extra tariffs, and they're expecting to collect $300 billion this fiscal year out of tariffs in the US. What they have done is they've passed a permanent tax cut bill, which was not big beautiful, his big beautiful bill, as you call it, the big tax cut bill, which was done through, again, a very technical process in the US called budget reconciliation, which only requires a majority to vote. And that made permanent the tax cuts that he had introduced when he was previously president. It also, though, introduced a 100% capital write-off for investment in the United States. So if you invest in new plant and equipment in the US, you get a 100% immediate write-off. So that's super accelerated depreciation, and various other things like the no tax on tips and whatever. So some of this money he needs, the US government needs, because they need to fund all of these other things that they've done. And there are many people who will argue that not only is he playing this geopolitical negotiating deal, but one of the reasons people are now coming to the view that there will be a permanent tariff, general tariff in the US, is because they need this money as a permanent source of revenue to offset other tax cuts that they've made. And if you think about it historically, 100 years ago, and certainly when Australia was federated, tariffs, or customs duties, we used to call them, were the major source of revenue to the government. That's why every city has a big customs house that's the grandest building around, because that was the treasury. So notwithstanding, as John said, we used to live in what we thought was a free trade world back at the turn of the 20th century. The reality is customs duties were the biggest source of revenue that most jurisdictions had. It only changed after the wars when income tax replaced those, and also when we introduced things like GST and VAT, other forms of indirect tax on consumption that have been used to offset the decline in customs duty that's been there. So there's a lot to think about there in that context, but there is more to the tariff debate in the United States than just the issue of, you know, where you import your Nikes from. Can the US build it at home? How competitive can they be? How many jobs can you get in manufacturing? A lot of these discussions, which are very complicated to think through, but also how they can do it politically is a big issue as well.
Just a clarification. I mean, Trump doesn't normally have the power to impose tariffs without Congress. He's doing it all by declaring national emergencies.
Yeah, but he through an act.
And so, yeah, I mean, since there isn't actually an emergency, these have been challenged, and the likelihood is, I think, the Supreme Court will ratify it. But
presidents since The first one I think who did it was before Ford, Nixon, before Nixon.
It has, I mean,
And it's been used by presidents of both sides for
well,
decades.
sorry, I think, well, again, Trump's declared 9 national emergencies in the course of a year. That hasn't been done. That hasn't been done by anybody in the past. So there's always everything has a precedent, but to say something has a precedent doesn't mean it isn't
Sure,
different.
but it has been done for a long time.
So what you've described, David, is really, to me, sounds like tariffs driving a domestic agenda, really revenue raising, redistribution, and some policy ends. For Linda, are there other, am I mischaracterizing this? Are there other unintended consequences for either domestic sort of economic outcomes? And also then how do we look at the consequences globally?
Whether the consequences are unintended or intended, I'm not sure. And there may be other things driving his political agenda. He has talked a lot, about wanting to rebuild manufacturing, domestic manufacturing, and the tariffs can do that for the industries that have had the tariff imposed on them. Most of the tariffs that were imposed on a country by country basis are the ones that are potentially not going to remain. They may not, but they're also the ones that he's used to do deals. So Trump's very big on doing deals. So he went in with an offer for all of these countries with what he was calling it reciprocal tariffs. And they happened in April and they were big. Everyone knew Trump was going to do, the steel and aluminium, all these sectoral tariffs. We kind of knew he'd flagged he was going to do it. He'd done it before. But these reciprocal tariffs, reciprocal sort of means, I'm putting a tariff on you because you're putting one on me. Australia doesn't have tariffs on the US, yet we got a 10% tariff.
Well,
as part of it.
under the free trade agreement.
Yeah.
Generally.
The reciprocal tariffs that Trump put in place were really big. They were massive, they were unexpected, and they actually had really important implications in the financial markets. So the increase in the effective tariff rate that would have applied had these reciprocal tariffs gone through would have been enough to put the US economy in recession. When he announced them, the share market fell. Interest rates initially fell because people thought, oh my goodness, the US economy is going to go in recession. There's going to be rate cuts from the Fed. This went on for a couple of days, and there was a big turning point in the bond markets where longer dated interest rates, the yield started to increase. And what that meant was all these bonds, these US bonds that are held by foreigners, people started to worry if they were ever going to get their money back. So they started to push up the yield. There was a really quick pivot in what came out of Trump after that. They came out and they said, oh, we're just tricking. You didn't see we were doing a deal. We're doing deals. We're going to put them off for 3 months. We're going to talk to people for 3 months and do deals, do trade deals. He wasn't just doing trade deals. In that time, he did a deal with Europe to get Europe to start to spend more money on defence. So I think that then revealed, there was a couple of really revealing things with what happened there. One was the defence spending in Europe, and that made us realise that, Trump's agenda also involves getting the allies to, pay their way effectively. The other thing he did was they did tit for tat tariffs with China. US one up, China one up, US one up. We ended up with tariffs, US tariffs on China of like 145%, something like that. Chinese tariffs on the US of like 84%. And if that actually happened, there'd be no trade between the US and China. It just wouldn't happen. So China was then revealed as the main target of Trump's tariff policies. So I think that sort of reveals a bit more. Yes, you have this domestic manufacturing idea that you want to hit and you want to improve your trade balance, but you also want to make sure your allies are pulling their weight in defense spending. Trump doesn't want to support them so much anymore. He can't afford to. And also that the main target for the US is China, and China's main target is the US.
So do you mean, in addition to the domestic agenda that they describe, he's trying to get geopolitical outcomes, get behavioral change? Okay.
Yes, for sure. There's a lot of things he's using this as a tool to negotiate with, as I said, because he has that ability. It's a tool that he has, or he believes he has, and has been used, that he can use for multiple purposes in that context. So yes,
I think we're understating the extent to which Trump just loves tariffs. I think, yeah. So I mean, from a US geopolitical point of view, saying I'll threaten to impose tariffs unless you do what I want, but if you do what I want, I'll take them away.
I think he will keep a baseline. He's already decided there's going to be a baseline that's going to be there permanently, as far as he's concerned.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I mean, precisely that, regardless of whether they make any sense geopolitically or domestically, the tariffs will be there simply because there's something he likes.
That's right. And well, the Australian government has basically accepted that the 10% tariff, which he's declared is the minimum tariff.
Yes.
Our government has basically accepted that's going to stay. They're not even bothering to try to negotiate or change that fact at the moment. The other thing that I think we should understand as well about the US, which is important to the is despite the size of the United States, it is not a very trading country. It is largely a domestic country. It's not like Australia. It's not like a Singapore. It's not even like Britain and these countries. It has a very small proportion of its GDP based on trade. So therefore, in seeking to limit trade, or that the damage to the United States is relatively small compared to a trading nation like Australia, open trading nation, or China, or others who are far more dependent on trade. And the US is in a position, unlike most other countries in the world, where in theory, if they decided to cut themselves off from the rest of the world, there are a few things they don't have, which they're very concerned about from a national security perspective, like advanced chips that they're desperately trying to make sure are manufactured in the US, and they are doing deals to do that and spending a lot of money. But they are one of the very few economies that could be self-sufficient, whereas there are very few countries in the world that could be self-sufficient because their trade exposure is quite small as a percentage of their economy.
But they're very exposed to interest rates.
They are. That's the other side. And the capital side of it is where people forget this part of the argument.
And the capital side is driven by what foreigners think of Trump's policies. So if he does crazy stuff that investors think, no, this is not sustainable, they're going to pull their money out. And then it all falls apart, even though trade's only 10% of their economy.
For what David was saying, and going back to where I was, what you had is a paradoxical situation where the world trading system is built around the US, and that reflects the fact that although it's always been kind of a closed economy, in 1950 it was by far the biggest in the world and therefore the biggest source of trade. It now accounts for only about 12% of trade, of global trade. But of course, 12% is enough if you're a country, you have 12% of your exports and somebody says, I'm going to hit you. The answer is you say, no, please don't hit me. But then as soon as Trump goes away, they start calling up all the other countries and saying, we really have to find a way of constructing a world trade system that doesn't involve the US. And we're seeing that, for example, with Canada essentially trying to get, which naturally, of course, by geography and by long history is the natural trading part of the US, but has been hit particularly hard, saying we're going to go in with Europe as best we can. And we're seeing that, of course, lots of people looking at China and the US and saying, well, actually, China looks like a better bet, even though, of course, China, as you mentioned, is perfectly capable of pulling the same kind of stunt they seem to learn faster than the US has that, that bullying other countries with tariff barriers isn't really a great idea.
And it's interesting to John's point, if you use Canada, having just come back from the US, that even though, we think of trade as just goods, but there's another part of trade, a bigger part of trade often now, is services. So what have the Canadians done? Canadian consumers have voted with their feet and they're not traveling to the United States. So much so that in the US, having just come back, they noticed that Canadian tourism to the United States is down between 30 and 50%. Now, that's a consumer embargo, if you like. It's not the government of Canada hasn't said, no, we're closing the borders, you can't travel across the border, but they're not. So, as I said, there's a lot more complex. We seem to focus just on one bit, which there's a lot of aspects to that, but the finance part is very important, and also the services, which of course is where Australia, we are both an exporter of services, but also there are a lot of tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers that operate for services around the world that prevent proper competition of services. So we do not definitely have open trade rules on services, despite what the WTO was promising over 20 years ago, that there would be not only free trade of goods, but free trade of services. It has largely collapsed.
And the reaction against that was part of the breakdown of the global neoliberal system,
including things like intellectual property protection, which of course the Americans always claim their property is being stolen because nobody's following the rules about intellectual property.
Except, of course, that claim was suddenly reversed when Google and Facebook discovered they could steal everybody's creative output. So it's a complete change of size. Yeah, we've seen a complete change of size in that book. I mean, everybody has. Virtually all the people who are in favour of intellectual property 3 years ago are against it now, and vice versa.
So, David, you made a comment a little earlier about the 10% tariffs on Australia staying. If we bring the discussion back to Australia now, what does that actually mean for Australians, and which industries are most likely to be affected?
Well, interestingly, despite the fact we have a free trade agreement with the United States is actually not a big trade partner of Australia, particularly in goods.
Yes.
Our major exports to the US, we do have some aluminium, some steel, not huge amounts. And even our biggest producer here, the former BHP Steel, because they have a plant in the US, they've actually said financially they don't see it as an impact because they'll redirect their exports from Australia to other jurisdictions and they'll pump up their production in the United States, which from a Trump perspective, if you were Donald Trump, you'd say, hey, win-win, I told you this is how it would work by going down this path. We do have some primary products, obviously, that we export to the United States. They would be affected. We don't have a lot of advanced manufacturers other than parts, which there are some like aviation parts that could be impacted. But again, there've been some exceptions have been made for certain inputs as well.
I think if you just look at the world goods market, Australia is actually a beneficiary. We're primarily a competitor of the US in agricultural products and so forth. As the effect of the tariffs will be to reduce US exports, inevitably, although the deals are supposed to do that. If you reduce your imports, you reduce your exports. Markets that the US previously competed with this, particularly in China, will be closed off to them. Brazil also, which has been hit very hard by the tariffs, at the same time has been a huge beneficiary because they've taken over the Chinese soybean market. So if we only viewed this, I think, in terms of saying Trump's going to impose their tariffs and there it will stop, we would actually be better off. The difficulty is really that the whole global trade system is unravelling in ways that could be very messy indeed.
So in terms of specifics, beef is our biggest export to the US, beef and meat. And climate change has meant that the US hasn't been producing as much beef. They've been killing their cattle off. So they actually need beef imports in the US. They can get them from us or they can get them from elsewhere. We've got a 10% tariff. Wherever else they can get them from has got like 40, 50%. So Brazil, yeah. So in that sense, we're relatively better off. We've also got a lot of demand for our beef from the Southeast Asian markets. So in terms of, what's important for Australia, and I sort of highlighted this a little bit at the start, was it's not necessarily the direct trade impacts that are most important for Australia, it's the indirect impacts on the rest of the world. So these trade wars are going to slow the global economy. On top of that, you add in the uncertainty created by tariffs being on, tariffs being off, up, down, this country, this industry, that industry, going to court, all that sort of stuff. Like it just creates uncertainty for businesses, and it's really affecting investment. So in terms of Australia, the tariffs are slowing growth in the whole world economy. It's not going into recession. It's pulled back from that after Trump pulled back from the peak of the reciprocal tariffs. So we don't think the global economy is going to go into recession, but it does mean as a trading nation, a lot of our export markets are not going to be growing as quickly. So it will weigh on our exports.
Certainly China, absolutely.
Certainly China.
Our biggest export market.
China's actually still holding up pretty well, if you believe the statistics, which we may or may not. So at the moment, so about 80% of Australia's exports go to the Asian region. About a third of our exports go to China. So China's big, South Korea, Japan, all those markets. If they hold up, then our exports hold up. But the uncertainty that is weighing on business investment, firms not knowing whether to invest, I think is actually a really important channel that takes a back seat. But I think it's got the potential to be more costly for the economy than the direct trade impacts.
If you look at the geostrategic elements as well, which I've done a lot of advice to governments around the world over the decades, ever since the GFC, which is when global trade and investment peaked, what we have seen, as well as you could say the collapse, I wouldn't say it's a collapse of the world trade system, but there's certainly been fragmenting, is what I would call regionalisation or local sourcing. And this has happened consistently. Even if you take, well, probably a good example is if you take the example of Tesla, right? You think, oh, Tesla used to manufacture all their cars in the United States. Well, very quickly, they worked out that the best thing to do is manufacture cars in the region in which we're going to sell them. Maybe Elon Musk had insight as to where the world is going. But this has been happening now for a good decade or more, where you've seen supply chains divide into regional-based supply chains. And you're seeing, therefore, within regions, whether it's in Asia, it's in, where India gets resources, where Europe gets its resources from North America, South America, a much more localized regionalization of their supply chains. Now, that's potentially, coming to a point, going to lead to suboptimal results. Because instead of operating on a global basis, you're going to be operating on a much smaller local basis, and the cost structures in different environments will not be the same. But we are certainly seeing, and that is one of the objectives, I would argue, that Trump and the Americans, not just Trump, a lot of the Americans have been pushing on national security grounds, is they need to have much more strategic capacity to produce everything the United States needs and not be dependent on anyone else, i.e. China or Russia or Iran or anybody like that. And that's why you see them focus on things like chips. And Biden introduced a chip act to do when he was president, rare earths and certain precious metals and the like, things that they have been there. You also see their energy revolution where they are now the largest exporter of oil. So in 20 years, the United States has gone from one of the biggest importers of oil and gas. They were just had a domestic gas market. Now they are made the biggest exporter of oil, and they are also now about to surpass Australia as the second largest gas exporter in the world. So a focus on, if they say, a strategic own sourcing can also have other benefits that a country like Australia, but also others around the world, are thinking about how do we deal with this new environment? Because in our case, we've pretty much hollowed out most of our economy. We are dependent on pretty much everywhere else other than for food and for energy at the moment, although we import most of our solar panels and windmills. they all are imported. So, you know, these other countries, particularly big ones and regions, are thinking, how do they manage in this environment if the system is breaking down into regions?
There is an important shift here under Trump. So Biden carried on a lot of this stuff, but lowered tariffs on allies. The idea was friendshoring, and of course maintained the North American Free Trade Agreement, which Trump renamed.
Negotiated,
Trump renamed differently, but so the US is no longer regional because the most hostility has been directed against Canada, which is its natural regional trading partner and long-standing ally. The only country that doesn't have any tariffs indeed is Russia. So Trump has the logic of Biden was very much directed at China. The idea was, the theory was what they called small yard high fence. What they would do is look at those areas of vulnerability and make sure they didn't depend on China. So they could rely either on the US or on friendly countries. And Trump has essentially thrown out the idea of friendly countries. Still has, from what you can see, a belief that there's a huge deal to be done with Russia down the track, which hasn't quite happened yet. But either the list of friends and enemies has changed, or the idea of friendshoring has been abandoned, depending on which way you want to look at it.
So I'll finish up with one last question to each of you, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. So the same question, we'll just work down, starting with you, David. If you had to advise Canberra tomorrow, what would your top tariff policy recommendation be? And also, how should Australian businesses plan for the uncertainty that I think Linda was talking about of an ad hoc US tariff agenda?
Well, first of all, it's not just an ad hoc US agenda. As I mentioned, we had a very ad hoc, pernicious Chinese agenda only a couple of years ago, and there's nothing to stop other nations doing so as well, because we know the rules system, to the extent that it ever existed, and it was a bit of a pretext in many cases, because it's based on your own compliance with what the so-called umpire said. Many countries never complied with the rules, so it was arbitrary. Is that you need to accept that if you're an exporter from Australia, you want to be diversified. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's a pretty standard financial risk issue anyway. You should never rely on just one customer and one marketplace. And in this environment now, more than ever, you want to be diversified. In terms of Canberra, what does this mean to us? Well, there's two sides. One, we have been a dreadfully uncompetitive, unproductive nation now for at least a decade, if not more. And if you want to be able to compete in an even more tricky, more difficult environment, you need to be super competitive. You need to be agile. You need to be dynamic. You need to be innovative to do that. Now, I'd have to say the Australian economy is anything but any of those descriptors. So the Australian economy needs to reform itself to be able to deal with a much more difficult, dynamic, changing, risky world environment. When it comes to tariffs, well, we are more of a trading nation. There is no benefit for Australia in imposing tariffs. As far as I can see, it will end up flowing through to consumers, because it's not like we have domestic producers who can step in any way. We gave up on domestic manufacturing a long time ago. We still have tariffs. I don't know why. We still have tariffs on motor vehicles, for instance, outside the free trade agreements. We still impose tariffs on the imports of motor vehicles. Yet we don't produce motor vehicles. We haven't for a decade, but we still have a tariff on the importation of motor vehicles coming into Australia, and there are a whole range of others. So if we really believe in that stuff and we want to compete, we need to lower our barriers of entry and trade and become much more independently competitive in any global environment we're faced with.
I'm not going to disagree. Two things that you said I strongly agree with. One, retaliating with tariffs is just like shooting yourself in the foot. No point in doing that. Number two, we do have a productivity problem, and to be a bit more optimistic, I think the government actually recognises that and is trying to put some fast wins in place that might start to turn things around. That's a whole nother conversation, which we could take up hours worth, but we won't. I think the government from what I can tell, is responding to tariffs like an economics textbook would tell you to. Don't put retaliatory tariffs on. Look for, try and support diversification in your export markets. They're doing that. They're trying to get a free trade agreement up with Europe. We only export about 3% of our goods to Europe. So that might be a market that we can look to expand. They're looking to expand defence. We might be able to make some defence drones that we can send to them. That might be something that's a good relationship for both. I guess the one thing I would recommend for the government, and it is sort of related to this productivity idea as well as the uncertainty that I've been banging on about. If you look at what's happening in the Australian economy at the moment, consumers are starting to look a bit better. Real incomes are growing again. You've had rate cuts, you've had tax cuts. Your labour market's still reasonably robust. So real disposable incomes are actually growing again. So the worst of the cost of living crisis is behind households, and they're saving more, they're spending more. Consumers are looking a lot better than they have for a couple of years. If you look at businesses, they're pretty anemic. The only things they're spending on is IT, so that they're trying to get the latest AI stuff, which people don't know how to use and get benefits from anyway, but they're trying to invest in it so people can hopefully learn how to use it and get benefits in the future. And the other thing they're investing in, sadly, is cybersecurity. So it's like an insurance type thing. You've got to do it, and it's kind of like a cost, and you hope that in future it's going to pay off by not having an event. But that's what they're investing in. They're not investing in much else. I actually think a policy prescription for now would be to switch from the focus on the cost of living for households to helping out businesses. We've got a lot of really small businesses in Australia, and a lot of them could do with some incentives to invest. And I think if you've got small businesses investing in IT stuff that will help their use of AI and improve their processes, that's potentially a really good thing to do at this part of the cycle, which would then hopefully increase our productivity further down the track. So that's my policy prescription.
Yeah, I mean, certainly no point in tariff retaliation, and I think we can go further. I mean, the reason we kept a bunch of tariffs is with the notion that we'd use them in trade agreements with people who were imposing tariffs on us. I think we may as well give up on that and be pure on that issue. The real issue, I think, in terms of the productive part of the economy is the digital issue and the need to establish, and this implies the same kind of intervention in tariff policy, is digital sovereignty. We need our own cloud, our own AI. We need to break with dependence on the big US firms for that, not only for economic reasons, but also because all those things, as we're seeing, can be weaponised against us by a potentially hostile government in the US. More generally, I think our future is in Southeast Asia. The geopolitical implication of this, I think, is that we should break with the US geopolitically. Until we do that, we'll never be part of Southeast Asia. We only get costs, I think, from our alliance with the US. They won't, I mean, it's very clear, I think, from what Trump said, that should we be engaged in a conflict in our region, there's zero chance the US would come to help us. So our far better bet is to say, let's make friends. Let's say, we're no longer an outpost of.
Does that include China?
Was it?
Do you want to be friends with China?
No. The whole
Bend the knee.
No, precisely.
Bend the knee.
Precisely, the
Surrender.
small countries in the region need to band together against both China and the US.
Okay, on that cheerful note, we'll open up to the audience for questions. Do we? Yep, down the. Ben's going to do the roving mic.
With some additional house rules as well, please do not press the button on the microphone. And John and Linda, can you please share that single microphone? Okay, who had their hand up? You good, sir?
Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. I'm curious, I was expecting an inflation bump, like a shock from these tariffs when they were implemented. But so far, it doesn't seem like we've seen that. And we had the data the other night, the PPI numbers were actually negative, suggesting potentially deflation. So would the panel care to comment on the interpretation of why we haven't seen that inflation shock that we might have expected?
Yeah, I'll take that one. We just haven't seen too much of it yet. We have seen some, and there was a bit of a blip down in that data that you referred to, but in general, we've seen about 3/4 of the increase in tariffs come through in the high import component of the producer prices. So the reason a couple of reasons it's being delayed. At the start of this year, there was a massive surge in imports. Companies imported so much stuff in anticipation of tariffs pushing up prices. So they've got to get rid of that inventory. They don't need to put prices up yet until they've run down that inventory. And it was so big that the increase in imports actually made GDP fall in the first quarter. And, as David said, trade's not a huge component of the economy. So it was really big. So they've got those inventories there that they've got to run down. Also the example of, I can wear it in my margins, that it goes up. It's being collected by the government. We know it's being collected because it's in the statistics. It just might not be passed on yet. So you can wear it in your profit margins for a little while, but at the end of the day, you're not going to be happy with that, and you're going to want to rebuild, and you're going to pass it on to consumers, and it's going to come up through the CPI. It's going to come up through the PPI. But the other thing too is with the tariffs, if we had have stuck where we were in April with the reciprocal tariffs, you would have seen a whole lot more by now. But there's been backflips, there's been deals, it goes up and it comes down, it goes up and comes down. So where it settles, this is still to be determined. So don't worry, there's more to come. But just for context on the financial markets, the Federal Reserve in the US has basically said they're looking through that. They're assuming the increase in tariffs causes a one-off shift in the price level. It doesn't cause ongoing inflation. So they get to target inflation and the unemployment rate as part of their dual mandate. And we've seen the unemployment rate start to pick up. The employment numbers have slowed down a lot. And so you'll probably see a Fed rate cut at next week's meeting. It's not because the inflation numbers are not going up as much yet. It's because they've got this dual mandate and they're choosing to look through that one-off impact on the price level.
Yes. What is the role and advantage of interdependencies in between countries in trade between nations? And how are these being broken down by the current forces of nationalism at work?
Yeah, I think, as I said, we had a system where those interdependencies were rooted through the US, a bunch of US institutions, which are still, for the moment, based in the US. We're going to have to as the US has said, essentially, we don't want interdependency. We're going to see all those arrangements rewired, but that's a process that's going to take quite a while.
Yeah, I'm not as pessimistic as my colleague here, John. I don't think the United States, even though there are some people in the US, want to retreat and just close their borders like they did after the First World War. But there is definitely a very strong, very vocal, very bipartisan position in the US that the free trade system that the US has supported and promoted and meant they would believe subsidized globally for a long period of time was at their expense. And therefore, there needs to be a rebalancing to make it fairer, because the United States is not 57% of global GDP anymore like it was after the Second World War. It runs deficits on its trade account and its current account, and it has for a long time. So it's dependent on foreign savings all the time to keep their consumers going. The middle class in the US has shrunk. It has very significantly, because the nature of the US is they provide limited support at the bottom, and those at the top have got ultra rich on the back of globalization. We just saw Forbes release their latest figures yesterday. Their top 400, they said there are now 900 billionaires in the United States. So being a billionaire no longer qualifies you to be in the top 400 of Forbes. It's so large. And the top, as we've seen in the US, has made vast amounts of money. And people think that is due to globalization. And therefore, this global anti-globalization thing needs to be balanced. I don't think the US is giving up on its allies. I don't believe that at all. I think Australia will continue to be a very strong ally, but they are, to John's point and to Linda's point, saying, well, why are we subsidizing Europe to fight a war in Europe's own backyard? These people have cut their defense spending to the bone over the last 30 years, and they expect us then to give all the money to them to support the Ukraine. Why don't they do it themselves? You know, Germany spends less than 1% of GDP on defense. The only countries in Europe that spend more than 3% are the Baltic states, because they genuinely fear Russia will walk across the border and take them over again. So the American taxpayer says, why are we spending hundreds of billions of dollars to prop you up? Isn't it time, after 50 years, or 70 years since the war, for you to step up and take on your own responsibility? So I think this is part of a broader rebalancing that's going on. I don't think it's the end of our alliance, but there's going to be some tricky negotiation to play through in the years ahead.
I guess I don't see why they won't say the same to us, should we need their help.
Because we're a key member of allies. That's why.
Nothing. We do. We have a question online from Meng Chen, who has asked, due to the stockpiling, tariffs might not show their real effects yet. So when are we going to see the real influence?
I think you covered that quite well, Linda.
Soon.
I think.
Soon.
It's playing through.
Yeah, I think we covered that. Yeah.
Going back to tariffs again, I know in a lot of developed economies, tariffs or the revenue that governments get from tariffs is a relatively small part of their GDP. Now, looking at the US, has there been any number crunching to say the revenue that's coming in from tariffs versus the costs to the consumer or to the economy or downstream industries? Has there been any sort of number crunching to see whether that lines up, or whether the revenue coming in from tariffs is a lot smaller than the downstream economic impacts, or vice versa? I'm just curious about that correlation, especially for.
Well, I think that will take time as well to play through. I mentioned the numbers, so they expect to get about $300 billion US this fiscal year. Now, how that passes through, though, you know, who's going to absorb it? Some of it undoubtedly will be pushed back to the producers. There's no doubt that some of these big US, likes of Walmart, you know, will push back to their suppliers overseas some of the tariff costs. But equally, they've said, well, some of it we will pass on to consumers, and they've already announced that they're going to increase some prices, but not by the full amount of the tariffs. And then the other one you have to look at is, and again, we didn't witness the huge inflation uptick that the US had over the last couple of years. And the reason I mention that is consumer prices of goods had been falling for like decades. Literally, the price of goods had been falling for decades. COVID hit, and suddenly there was a repricing of an enormous amount of products in the supply chains. Like, I remember cars from the 1980s through to 2001, car prices used to fall every year, not increase, they'd fall. Phones would fall in price, not increase. Electronics would go down every year. 2001 hit, and there was this huge change because supply chains got clogged and repricing happened. So we saw for the first time car prices jumped by like 25%. Electronics jumped in price for 20%. And the reason I mention that is because a lot of these companies now have rebuilt some fairly decent margins into their product lines. And Apple released their latest iPhones just yesterday in the US. They actually cut the price of the new model iPhone. So far from saying, oh, we're going to increase it because of they're all imported because of tariffs, they actually decided they were going to cut the price. Now, maybe they've got the margins to cope with that because they are very highly profitable with a 30% margin on those products. The fact they're doing it, that's what they've said, is that's the way they can manage it. So it's going to be a combination of a lot of factors, and it will probably take some time. John will probably write a paper, a research paper, in a couple of years on trying to work this through.
I want to make a separate point, which is the days when a government could finance itself from tariffs are long gone. The reason the Commonwealth government could rely on tariffs as its main source of revenue, customs excise, in 900 was because it was tiny. We had a very small defence force. We didn't have an old age pension. We didn't have a publicly funded university system. We didn't have anything. The income tax has been the big tax, but even when you look at GST is levied at 10% across the board. To get the revenue of the GST from the relatively small part of the economy that's imported, we'd need a tariff of 50 or 60%. So although the tariffs will offset the big tax cuts we've seen in the US to a small extent, the fact is that US has built in huge deficits that can't be changed with any politically feasible solution for the foreseeable future. And we're seeing that much more than the impact of the tariffs. If we look at why interest rates are rising, it's because essentially everything is being stopped up by big government budget deficits, particularly in the US, but also, of course,
all around the world. Look at the French.
For one more.
Yes.
A couple more questions, one up the front, I think, and then one online. We had a person up the front on the right-hand side who had a question? You still have that question, sir?
Got two questions. There's been a lot of talk about investment in the United States. So, they talk about trillions of dollars of corporate commitments, and then that Trump has apparently struck deals with different governments and countries to invest in the United States. So any kind of insight on that? And the other thing is around the uncertainty. So the US, you've got your midterm election, which is only 12 months away. What's the Republican Party thinking? Why are they motivated to put Trump up and obviously support the tariffs and all the rest of it? I mean, they clearly want to get re-elected for the midterm. So what are they going to want to see their constituents seeing, 12 months from now?
Well, if I take the last bit, and I think this is the key point, why there's a big battle going on with the Fed is because the president and the Republicans in Congress want the US economy booming, to use his term, booming, come the midterms. Now, that's very hard to do, despite the fact they're running a big deficit. They've been running a big deficit for a long time. So it's not like that's going to continue to stimulate the economy. All they've done is made the tax cuts permanent. The actual extent of the tax cuts is not that much larger than it would have been anyway. They've prevented tax rising, but they haven't. So they want interest rates to come down to stimulate more consumer spending. And they believe that if people are feeling better, if real incomes start to rise again, and they are rising a bit in the US, well, they hope that they'll get re-elected, although it's highly unlikely, I suspect, based on historical numbers, that they would win the midterms, but you never know. Anything can happen. Coming back to what was your first question again? The corporate. Yeah, this seems to definitely work. And it's not just what Trump's negotiating now. You've got to remember, the US passed some time ago a series of corporate tax acts. So their corporate tax rate is 21%, for instance. They also have various incentives, some of which are being phased out. For instance, investing in the chip industry, which was passed during Biden's time in the presidency, rare earths. They've now introduced accelerated depreciation, as I said, so you get 100% for capital investment into the United States. So it's pretty attractive when you look at it around the world as a destination to invest. If you think you can succeed in that market, which is not always a given, it's a pretty attractive place. The tax rate's attractive, the regulatory environment's attractive, you get approvals very quickly. You've got states that will offer you a range of concessions, from building to labour arrangements, in terms of training, to payroll tax exemptions and holidays. So the US is actually a very attractive place for a lot of global businesses when they're looking at the world to say, well, that's going to be a market for me. Why wouldn't I invest there? And then also, by the way, I get the commander-in-chief comes out and praises me. So I get $1 billion of free advertising by doing the right thing. I get congressmen, senators, everybody all over me saying what a great person I am. Maybe that's why Gina Rinehart's putting her money there. It's why Anthony Pratt's moved to the United States and he said he's putting all his money there. There are numerous Australians who've said exactly that same thing. We're putting our money into the US rather than into Australia.
To comment, I mean, you may have been referring more specifically to the national commitments that were made in these trade deals. And that is when Trump signed a trade deal with country X, they say we're going to invest hundreds of billions. And the answer really, I think, is all they want to do is give Trump a piece of paper he can wave. The governments don't really have any power to direct investment and no intention of doing it. But for Trump, the deal is the deal. A second point is, while there's lots of stuff that's attractive, we've just seen something which is fairly unattractive, namely the raid on the Hyundai plant in Georgia, where essentially the Koreans were unable to get their skilled engineers in there because of immigration restrictions. So they sent them in on business visas, which was a dodge. And the ICE, the immigration control, said, well, that's not good. We're going to throw all your guys in jail. They managed to pick up a few Japanese just to sweeten the pot. And so in a sense, I think it's important not to see this as a coherent strategy. If you wanted to encourage investment in the US, you'd be looking at saying, let's keep the cheap labour we have from illegal immigrants, instead of which they're very much not doing that, even when, as I say, these are people they actually very much need.
Just to summarise, the US does have a lot of good investment opportunities, but it's very risky. And so it's risk and return that you need to consider. It's not just a return. So,
last question. Amazing. So we have our last question from online from Eddie. And Eddie has asked, are US multinational corporations realising their profits outside the US in tax havens? And does that have an impact on the US economy?
Yeah. It's a very complex issue talking about international tax. Certainly big tech. There are various big ones that, because they trade all around the world, the US again has quite an unusual tax system where they allow you to keep all of your offshore profits outside the US. You don't have to pay US tax on them. While they're outside the US, you only have to pay it when you return them, when you repatriate them to the US. And then they've had this history of giving you a special incentive to repatriate. So then they say, well, if you repatriate, you don't have to pay the normal tax rate. You can pay a much lower tax rate, which led, for instance, last time it happened to Microsoft remitting $1 trillion to the United States, which was the largest ever single foreign remittance into the US, because that's how much money they had accumulated outside the US. Interestingly, though, when the US passed its laws, when it cut the corporate tax rate to 21%, they introduced two other measures which actually harm offshore investing by US companies. So one relates to royalties. If you go and move your royalty income to an offshore tax haven like the Bahamas or Bermuda or something like that, they impose a tax on that. So you have to pay in the US a tax on that. And they also have another one for related party transactions, which is being subject to a whole lot of changes anyway globally. It's what's called the BEPS process, so we won't go into that because that's a whole new discussion as well about base erosion and profit shifting, which the global world's been looking at changing the rules. But the US themselves acted unilaterally and have rules about that too. So if you are selling goods to another related party at a below rate, you have to pay tax on that too. So when they cut their corporate tax rate, not only did they cut it, they actually introduced a whole series of measures to say to American companies, invest in the US, we'll make it really attractive. You invest offshore, beware, because we've got all these mechanisms to tax you extra money on your offshore investment income if you fall foul of the rules.
Great. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the discussion. So I want to thank all of our panelists so much. That was such an engaging, interesting and insightful discussion. So please firstly just join me in